to the table. And let's go ahead and move forward. I have to tell you, one thing I love about Latino conferences is that the clock doesn't rule everything quite as much. And conversation is stronger and more valued than the time. But Anglo conferences, which this is because it's a U of U, whether you like it or not, is ruled by the damn clock. I don't know who died and made it God, but it's what it is. So we have time to engage in conversation with our panelists, who are Janan Graham-Russell, Paul Reeves, and Professor Ignacio Garcia. And I look forward to hearing their voices as well as the voices of you in the audience. You know the routine. The microphone is out there. It'll be passed around. Please speak into the microphone. Please make sure to focus on a question and try to be brief as possible so that we can get as many voices in as we can. Now, the brief is to the questioning, not necessarily to the answers, because the answers need to be adequate. This is a wonderful conference, and so I shall silence myself and allow the voices of everybody to go. So please, any questions or comments to get us going in this panel discussion? Could we have a microphone here and then to the gentleman there? Where are the microphones? Thank you, Boyd. Right here, Boyd, right here. To the lady right here in the blue sweater. And then to the gentleman over here in the green plaid shirt.
Thank you. My question is similar to a question yesterday. I've got children, adult children, who love the church but are uncomfortable. And I want them to stay, so I keep telling them, it'll change. And I wanted to know if you feel that we're changing and it's getting better, or will we implode?
You know, I think that it only gets better as we create those spaces. You know, as someone who grew up in my generation was arrogant enough to think that these five of us who got together and said, oh, by the time we're this age, everything will be resolved. Where it has been resolved, it has been creating the spaces for ourselves. And I think there's something about those who want to leave, who don't fully grasp that no one's ever totally happy with everything the church does. In fact, that if we would just emphasize what the leadership or what happens there, I mean, there's a lot of blessings to the gospel. You know it, I know it. But those are complicated issues. Where we really live our spirituality is in the local. It's in the spaces that we grow. And I think that it's something that Gina said about, you know, developing within our culture, within our spaces. I think that's the one way. It's not giving up on the small spaces, finding them. And I'll tell you, we're not supposed to jump around. But the greatest thing I ever did when I was here and I was facing all these difficulties in the church and at BYU, is that one day my wife and I had arrived at the little ward building that we attended, and I looked at her and she looked at me and we said, I don't want to get off. And she said, I don't either. And I thought, oh, there's Brother Mesa, who's now bishop in the 33rd ward. Now, stake presidents, you know, forget what I'm saying, and so we went over there and it saved our lives. We were strong enough to survive it, but we wouldn't have had much of a quality of spiritual life. Sometimes we have to find those spaces, whether it's at home, whether it's in our local ward, whether it's in an institute, whatever it is, whether it's a group of people hanging together. Those are the things that really save us. That's why we stay in the church, because of that. And so I don't know how in your situation, but I think it's about saying, look, find that little space there. And when you find a space, everything you thought about what the kingdom should be, it usually turns out to be that way, but only in those small spaces.
So I'm a historian, so I think about that question historically. And, you know, as an American historian, this American triumphal master narrative went through a shift of its own. It ran into the Vietnam War in the 1970s, and the way that we tell the story of American history went through a fundamental change, but there was turmoil amongst historians as the new narrative started to emerge. And what did that triumphal narrative look like if we understood it from the Native American perspective, or the African American perspective, or from the perspective of women? And I think the church is currently going through a transition in the way it tells its own story as well, and it's painful. And we're losing people as a result of, sort of grappling with that change. But I have hope that, in fact, we will emerge with a more complicated narrative of the way that we tell our own story that is more inclusive, and that can help create more inclusive spaces like Ignacio is talking about. So I remain optimistic and I remain hopeful. It's just slow. It's painfully slow. But in American history, it was slow too. Before it started actually, the new kind of history that emerges from the 70s starts to make it into the actual textbooks, and then starts getting taught in college classrooms, and there's a new narrative that starts to emerge that a new generation is raised on that's more complicated than the previous one, and that takes time. And I think we're in the middle of that process as a church, speaking historically, right? I know there are other issues at play. I'm speaking about the way that we tell that story. And the other thing that gives me hope and optimism, I grew up in very white, very Mormon, Hurricane, Utah, but pronounced hurricane, southern Utah. And I go to church with my mom when I visit. And several Samoan families moved into the very white and very Mormon ward that I grew up in, and my mom has been there 60 years. And I have now experienced the sacrament prayer read in Samoan, prayers given in Samoan, talks given in Samoan, and it's still predominantly the people I grew up with, but they have integrated this group, and the language is Samoan. And I've experienced this when I go and visit, and the old-time members of the congregation don't seem, they just sort of roll with it. And it gives me hope that if in very white, very Mormon hurricane, something like this can happen, that, that we can recognize and celebrate each other's identities and cultures, and, have those kind of expressions and have those kind of spaces where we feel like we can be who we are.
I'd like to echo the idea of the creation of spaces. I think sometimes talk about this Mormon imagination, we talk about faith and doubt, it's this binary. So either you're completely faithful or you have this doubt and you need to leave and you have no reason to be here. And so I think the church is moving in that direction, but that direction has to be led by us. And creating those spaces and having these conversations and making it a safe space for those who are struggling.
Sir, and if we can make sure that everybody speaks very directly into the microphone, please.
This is specifically for Hermano Garcia. So I served my mission in Santiago de Chile, and my question is, I'm going to try and articulate it as well as possible. I remember you had mentioned something about saying, oh, we don't want those Latinos in the States. They give us problems, so let's go down south.
Boy, did they find out there's a problem there.
Well, and so that goes with my question is when I was in Chile on my mission, and then, after coming back and start to kind of unravel my own faith and deconstruct and find out that we actually do have a complicated narrative, as Brother Reeve talks about, my question would be, when this does happen for the Latino members in Chile, Paraguay, España, and all of these different places, do you think that could be connected to the blossoming that has been talked about, or something of that sense, or what will happen when that simplistic kind of narrative stops being told or accepted by the members in Latino America?
That's a tough one, but I think that what is happening in Chile, what is happening in Argentina, what is happening in Peru, what is happening in Central America, what has happened in Mexico, is that many people don't relate to the church as well. Because when you tell someone they're blossoming, that there's an expectation. It's like when I say to you, you're graduating, well, you're freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. And so there's a progression there. And what has happened in the church in Latin America, and I think partly in the Southwest, is that the promise doesn't hold very well, because none of us, and the great farm worker activist Cesar Chavez once said, I don't want to be erased from life, because the people say, your kids will get out of the fields and they'll become architects and they'll become engineers and everything is fine. And he said, but I'm not ready to be erased from life. And there's, I think, a lot of Latino saints who are not ready to feel like they're erased. And so they struggle, and so they look around. I think being in the faith is a struggle anyway. But I really believe that and I've said this in other places, and it's complicated and maybe controversial among some Latter-day Saints. We need a ministry. We need a Latino ministry, just like we need the ministry and we need a theology of how and what we believe. And I think so often we try to go there and organize things, okay? There's something that Elder Wells, I think his name was, who said that he went to Monterrey and he was asked to call a new stake president. And he spent days and days and hours and he couldn't find one. And he had this trusty old Mexican counselor who said, Elder Wells, you're thinking of Provo, Utah. Of calling somebody in Provo. This is not Provo, Utah. This is Monterrey, Mexico. You need someone who understands that. He said, I went home, I prayed, and that same night I had the answer, and I called someone. So I think there's this disconnect. And I have a really good friend who's a businessman who said, if I had a division in which I had those poor returns, I'd fire everybody and start again. And I wonder if a Hispanic ministry or someone who really tries to understand could do something, because there's so many wonderful people. The other thing, real quickly, is this sort of dichotomy that you mentioned. You're either super faithful or you're not. And I remember, real quickly, when I was a bishop, I had this woman who came to me and she said, I love the church, I love everything else, but I don't think Joseph Smith was a prophet of God. And I said, well, just stay with us. Just be with us. Work with us, and then you can figure out, in the end, I'm not the one to judge you about, well, maybe a temple recommend, but, and she felt happy. And she was dealing with her own trials and tribulations. And we don't do that enough in the church.
Another question? Yes.
I have a question. I want to direct it at some of Paul's comments about whiteness. And my sense is that perhaps there may be some fragility around white identity historically. If Mormon immigrants came in to Utah and they were seen as lesser whites. And I'm wondering if that's the sense that you got, and if everything from then has been to sort of try and perform a kind of a muscular, sort of outreached Mormon white identity in order to address some of those demons from the past, I'm wondering. And then, of course, people of colour are caught in the crossfire of all of that because of that sort of long-standing fragility.
That's exactly right. That's the basic premise that I outline in the book. Mormons go from being racially suspect actually to accepting. So 1830s, 1840s, the charges leveled against them, they're opening an asylum for rogues and vagabonds and freed blacks. They're accepting Native Americans, people who the rest of American society know should be excluded. Mormons are welcoming in. A British officer on tour of the United States in the 1830s reads a copy of the Book of Mormon. He comes across it. He goes back to Britain and writes a 3-volume history of his tour of the United States. And in the section where he talks about Mormonism, he says, they got this wonderful verse in this book of the book they claim to be scripture, and it's going to get them in trouble in the state of Missouri because it says all are alike unto God, including black and white. They're promoting racial equality in a country that actually rejects racial equality. And so the argument is that, Mormons move towards whiteness, claiming whiteness for themselves, and one of the most significant ways you do so in the 19th century is in distance from blackness. And so across the course of the 19th century, you have these race-based priesthood and temple restrictions put in place, solidified by the first decade in the 20th century when you erase from collective Mormon memory the black priesthood holders who complicate that story. You solidify your whiteness, and the story is that, it was white temples and white priesthood from the beginning. And God put it in place, and man can't do anything about it. And it's going to take a revelation to get rid of it. And in fact, it takes a revelation in 1978 to get rid of it. So you're absolutely, that's the trajectory I lay out in the book. And so Mormons go from not white enough in the 19th century to too white by the 21st century. When Mitt Romney runs for the presidency, Lee Siegel writes an editorial in the New York Times calling him the whitest white man to run for president in recent memory, even though all of our presidents up through President Obama have been white. Romney's Mormonism made him too white. And so that's the basic premise. And other groups in Mormonism then get marginalized along the way as Mormons attempt to claim whiteness for themselves and secure a place at the American table.
Yes.
So my question, it's kind of historical, but it's really for everyone. So how would you say that the racism and cultural diversity that, plagued the New Testament and the discrimination in the New Testament between, the different peoples, how does that compare with what we're facing now? Because we know in their days, their issues led to the apostasy. So how does that compare with what's happening now in the church?
Any takers?
That's a tough one. But I'll tell you what, I think that the church is confronting, the church is confronting a problem. I think if you were in the house of Israel and you only cared about your small group, then it was okay to stay in Jerusalem. If you're talking about a wider one, as Paul did, then you were going to confront the issues of race, ethnicity, and other issues. I think the church is at a crossroads where it will only grow so far with sort of white people. I remember a few years ago, President Hinckley, in a moment where he really wasn't thinking about, he was in front of a mic, said, the one disappointing thing about this year is that we didn't have enough Americans and Canadians get baptized. And it was a year that the church had just exploded. And I don't think a lot of people caught it, except maybe people of color who said, oh, we've just had this record crop of people of color and the lamentation. Now, I understood what he was trying to say. The gospel should be for everybody, and everybody should be converting. But I think that the greatest dilemma for the church is race, ethnicity, it's gender. And those are things we have to resolve theologically. Otherwise, we're going to have 10% activation in Chile. 10%. It's one of the biggest countries. We love to put it out there and say Chile, so many members in Chile, and only 10% of them are active. If we don't grow and if we don't sort of re-energize those people and grow, then we're going to be a church that not only doesn't grow like we thought we were, but that in fact begins to decline because, as Elder Jensen said, we're experiencing a hemorrhaging, especially of young people. And if you don't have young people, guys like me will die in a few years. But if we don't have people like you, then the church does face a real. And I would argue that it isn't only PR, it is theological. How do we deal with race, with difference, with nationality? And if we don't deal with that, we are going to be stymied. And what happens, which I think is happening now, is that we'll create a group of very elite members, well-educated, well-versed in the gospel, ready to do anything for the church. And many of them will either be white or those who have sort of been able to be privileged to be in that elite sector. I really think it's happening, and we need to deal with that.
I like his question because what he said was, we've done this before. We've gone down this path before. We've excluded people before, and this has caused an apostasy, and he's correct. And when I look at the church now, because I've been on a journey as well, and Paul knows very well the journey I've been on. And, church and God and everything we want, it isn't always out there. Maybe it's inside of us. Maybe if we really were the people we say we are and really reached out and loved and did the things we say we do, maybe it'd be real. But it's a difficult and it's a huge dichotomy of a concept when you start talking about something out there that people keep thinking it's out there. But is it back here with us? And this is why we lose the youth, because the youth, I love them. The millennials, they're very transparent. You tell me to walk 4 blocks down the road and turn right, and I'm going to find an ice cream shop. That is exactly what I expect. But when I walk 4 blocks down and I turn to the right and I don't see it, then you didn't tell me the truth. And what I want from you is the truth. Is this gospel real? Is it real? Why can't I see it? Why can't I feel it? Why isn't it happening around me? Because if I cannot take my burdens to the church and lay them down, where am I going? And so it's not just the Mormon church. On my journey, I've discovered it's not just the Mormon church. I was Baptist for years. A lot of churches do that to people. And when they get disappointed and disillusioned, then this is what you have, an apostasy. And so I really like your question. And what I would say to us is, you make the change, but you transform inside yourself. The transformation for religion has to come from inside. If it doesn't come in here, then it's never going to happen, because you can't relay it to anybody. You can't talk about it to anybody, because you know what? You're not living it. So until you start living it, then you don't really realize what it is. And it has anything to do with the pigment on anybody's skin. It has to do with who you are, what you believe, and you have to emanate it. You got to live it, breathe it, and you have to be transformed.
I'm just going to respond to one of the things Diane said about this generation, especially sort of wanting the truth. So I teach a class on Mormonism at a secular state university, University of Utah. My student population runs the gamut from practicing Latter-day Saint to people who have no concept of religion at all, to people who are former Latter-day Saints. But without fail, every time I teach this course, I have Latter-day Saint students who say to me, I took this class because I want to know what they're not telling me at the institute across the street. That's their perception, and that echoes the point that Diane was making. Whether right or wrong, that's their perception. Their perception is that they're not being told the complete truth over there. If I take a course on the main campus, maybe someone will be open with me.
I live in Lehigh. I have a neighbor who left the LDS Church because of the rescinding of the priesthood ban. He likes to, he has a lot of Tea Party events at his house and things like that. And so he thinks he's divinely doing the right thing. And so my question to all three of you is, if we brought up Bruce R. McConkie's mentioning that we're disavowing everything we've said in the past, right? And we've quoted the Book of Mormons saying all are alike unto God. But we still are omitting all those repeated references to race, to darkness being evil and lazy and indolent, and all of those terms that are in the canon, right? The sacred canon, the Book of Mormon itself. And so my question is, what will it take for the leaders to denounce that part of the canon? And if you had their ear, what would you tell them, or how would you tell them to tell the church in General Conference to really lay this stuff to rest to really stop? That's my question for all three of you. If you could sit on the shoulder of the brethren and tell them what to say, what would you have them say?
That's a great question. I've spoken a lot about with friends and family members, and what would it really take? I think specifically in terms of the priesthood and temple restrictions and the revelation that happened in 1978, the fact that Black Mormons continue to be in the church serves as almost as a contradiction to Brigham Young's pronouncement in 1852. And so for the church leaders to denounce those passages in the Book of Mormon and the Pearl of Great Price they'd have to admit that they were wrong. And I don't know how easily that would even happen. I would maybe in more words, but your second part of your question was, what would be whispered into their ear for them to? Could you repeat the last part?
Yeah, just to address that, the fact that it's in the canon. So they've denounced, all of the folk lore about why, but they still have the canon.
Right.
That makes those claims that people can still believe if they want to. So what would you ask them to say to really get this stuff behind us for real?
Yeah, so I had mentioned in my discussion about racism being a sin and white supremacy being a sin, and recognizing those passages are contradictory towards to uplifting people. Yes, they have to tell the truth. Yes, they have to tell the truth, and be hard.
I would tell them to go work at the cannery. And the reason I say this is, after I had made a comment about immigration, I got all these nasty letters from saints about, go home, go back to Mexico and whatever. And there was this fellow who I knew was trying to be a good saint, but who just couldn't get over the 12th Article of Faith and law and all. And so he wrote to me and he said, "Why do you believe this way?" So I wrote to him and explained myself, and he was very nice, and he said, "Thank you." About 2 months later, he wrote to me a long letter, and he said, "I've been assigned to the cannery, and my job is to take people who don't have jobs and who need food assistance and take them to different places, sites in the church so that they will work." He said, "Well, lo and behold, they gave me 5 undocumented workers, 5 Latinos who were undocumented." And he said, my first thing was, where's ICE? Where's the number? But he said, "But I'm a good saint, so I can't do that." If the brethren, whoever the brethren there was, decided that I would do this, then, and it's good to have sort of a little bit orthodoxy there, because he said, whatever they said, I would do. And so he talks about over the month where he has to eat with them. He has to rest with them. He has to travel with them. And in the process, and Latinos like to talk a lot. So they told about their family, about how they came across, what they're going through, what their aspirations and dream was. And he wrote to me at the end, he said, "I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I'm going to help these people. I want them to stay." And he said, "Now they're my brothers, and their families are my families." So I think if the brethren would spend a couple of months with Gina, a couple of months with Moroni, a couple of months in my ward, a couple of months in the I think we have they and we have created this crust around them, that when they go to a place, we give them everything beautiful. If you're a stake president or a bishop, you want him to see the best and the uncomplicated and the simple. And they are not, despite how much they travel, they do not see the complications of race, class, gender, poverty, ethnicity. They don't, and we do a bad job of not letting them know. There is a wonderful letter that was sent to President McKay by this African American man who tells his story, and I won't tell the whole story, but it's beautiful because he says, "I was so involved and active and so much a part of my youth program until we all turned 12. And when you read that letter, you cry. There's no way. And they need to read those letters constantly. And it'd be better to have an hour of meditation and scripture, because these are scriptures in a different way. That's what I would tell them. Go to the canneries, go live with us, read those stories, and maybe then we know where you're at. We know that you're saying this is not right, but maybe you'd have the passion to go say, don't do that. You know.
I would just add to address the passages in the Book of Mormon. I guess I would ask them to not ignore them, but to speak to them. And there are available interpretations. I'm not suggesting that I don't understand that, especially in the 19th century, Mormons read those as explicit and literal, right? But there are a variety of interpretations in the 21st century church that you can bring to those passages. So Marvin Perkins and Darius Gray have blacks in the scriptures. You have other ways of grappling with those same very racist passages. And you have Jared Hickman, right? So Nephi is, in fact, racist as he is describing this process. But the book as a whole is a rejection of white supremacy because the dark-skinned people win the Book of Mormon, right? And so it's a rejection of the notion that white people are somehow superior. But there's no message of that over the pulpit. And so I would ask for them to actually address those issues and give people a way of reading those verses that aren't literal or the way that they were, I guess, received literally in the 19th and 20th centuries. Yeah.
So this question is more geared towards Professor Garcia, but I open or accept any of the panel's comments. I'm a LDS Latino from Texas, and these safe spaces that you're talking about, I've experienced them. However, throughout my travels, especially in the Southwest, California and Utah, I've seen within our own safe spaces, our own wards and branches, that the leadership, many times, often, are white men. The bishops are white men. The branch presidents are white men over Latino and Spanish-speaking wards. And I guess my question is, even in our safe spaces, how I struggle with that concept that, there's no worthy Latino men to lead our own people. Why is this happening so often? And so I guess that's my question.
I think one of the reasons why it seems to be happening more often, and I've seen this, which for a while didn't seem to be going there. I think there's a development in the church, and when I talk about elites, Latter-day Saints, if you're right genealogy and you started off right and you stayed in the sort of the narrow path, you gain a lot of advantages, and particularly in the church. And what I see, because I saw this at BYU, is that you have these children of these people, and you want them to have leadership positions, but they can't in their ward, right? They can't in their ward. But they're wonderful people, and they are wonderful people, and they're knowledgeable, and they know the church, and they know the doctrine, and so why not put them where people need them? Why not place them where they can teach? And you see this more and more. But there's another layer to that. There is finding that Latino within the stake that doesn't go to Latino ward, that doesn't particularly want to be there, and choose him as a leader. I mean, that's happened in my ward twice. And I have such incredibly brilliant men in my ward. Women, too, but, that's a dilemma. But, in fact, the best bishop would have been a woman. But anyway, and they went out and found two good men. Again, they're good men, and so they now lead, right? Which means that they have to learn the culture and everything else. So what do we do for those spaces? I think one, which I think we did in Tucson, Arizona, is that we were very firm and very much indicated in good words that, hey, you're coming here Let's find the right person here. Let's begin. And Latinos have to accept, and they have to talk about it. One doesn't have to be angry. One can say, did you think about what you just did? What's it do to a Latino ward that constantly gets called with a non-Latino leadership? We have to be able to articulate and say that. And it's hard to do that. And for a lot of Latinos, it's very hard to go to the stake president and say, can you just explain? I'm not challenging. I just want you to see what is your stewardship and your vision for my ward. Because if it's the same one as mine, then it's very hard to understand. So it is happening. And we're too accepting. And by that, I don't mean conflict, but I think there has to be a sense that you don't need to go there. You don't need to go there. If you, and I asked one regional representative once, I said, would you do that in a white ward? Would you bring somebody from the 3rd ward to be in the 5th ward? And he said, of course not. He said, would you divide a ward into 5 little branches where all our auxiliaries are destroyed basically to this ward? And he said, no, I wouldn't. I said, then why do you do it for us? And he just shook his head and just said, yeah. He didn't say he wouldn't do it again, but at least he got hit right here in nice words, and we were, friends, we parted. I just asked him those questions. Would you do that in that ward? And by the way, I have an appointment with my stake president to ask him that. And he's not very receptive, but nonetheless. Why? Just tell me why. Tell me why you do, and don't blame the Lord, because we have this tendency to blame the Lord for everything. Don't blame the Lord. Maybe, I believe that leaders have a stewardship, and the Lord gives us a lot of leeway when you're a leader, because then he can come back and say, I'll remove that egg yolk from your face. And so we make decisions based on our own realities, and we have to challenge those realities, not what God says. Once he's called and confirmed, God will confirm him. But it's before the process, and we have to be honest about it. And we're just not.
And would you admit that people, regardless of how they have been placed in positions, as you say, all the way, they're human, they have biases. They have unconscious bias, implicit bias, and right there, that's a lot of unconscious bias. That I don't challenge my own, I don't challenge me, I don't challenge my own beliefs. I start operating right there, where I believe. And this is why we get to places like this. And it's unfortunate that people in leadership positions don't understand this. Don't understand that they have biases and that they're functioning within that bias.
They don't know their flock as well as they think they do.
No, they don't.
And when you know your flock, you realize what works and what they need. Because you can always find 100 men, and if it's a position for women, 100 women that could do a good job. But it's what your vision of your stake, your ward, your district, your mission, that really decides among those 100 good people.
But if you look at it, it's not their fault. They are pure and perfect. They've been given you. So they're just operating on their pure perfection. They don't have bias because they said they don't have.
Well,
One thing, we need to make sure that we've got the microphone when we speak, please.
I quickly wanted to add on to that. It's interesting because I lived in D.C. for a couple of years when I was in graduate school, and if you know the demographics of D.C., it's largely black population with a growing gentrification with white population, but the leadership in the area was considerably white, and even my stake president. One time I went to his house, and it was just this extravagant house out in the middle of nowhere, and I'm like, how is he? He's a great man, but how is he able to connect all the way out in Virginia to, the mother or the father who's struggling to put food on the table? And so I think there's this kind of idea within Mormonism that positions of leadership need to be filled with people of prestige, and it's this kind of racial and classist dynamic where you equate whiteness with prestige, and I think in a lot of ways it's an extension of the prosperity gospel, that if you've achieved X, Y, and Z, that you must be a very good person, but we're not really looking at, Black members, Latinx members who are fully capable of being bishops and being church leaders, but there's just this disconnect.
So I'll just add, to emphasize what Janan and Ignacio said. We had a conference at the University of Utah, Black, White, and Mormon, a couple of years ago. One of the panels was race at the ward level, and one of the panelists was Peter Johnson, who is a professor at the University of Alabama, also a stake president. He converted from the Nation of Islam to Mormonism. Now a stake president in Alabama, and he talked about when he was made stake president, one branch in an inner city location in his stake. The prior stake presidents had always appointed someone from outside of that branch to preside over that branch. And he said, I had a Black Latter-day Saint in that branch who walked a couple of blocks from his house to the branch meeting house to worship on Sunday. Never been considered as someone for a branch president. And he came in as stake president and made him the branch president. And people in that branch said, I never thought I would have someone sitting on the stand that looked like me. Very simple, right? This guy is 3 blocks away from the ranch meeting house, walked to church every Sunday for 20 years. Never been considered as branch president for that branch. And it dramatically changed the dynamics in that branch, just that one simple thing.
I'm going to exercise the power of the microphone and pose a question. There's a history here, and I'd appreciate it if people would comment on the history, because this is a very old issue. And in terms of Latinos, it goes back to the Third Convention in Mexico, which is a very important part of church history, and almost no English-speaking members know about it. But one of the key issues was the need and the desire of Latino members in Mexico, and particularly members who were indigenous from Nahuatl-speaking communities or immediately after Nahuatl, who had become culturally mixed, for what they called a Mexicano de carne y raza. They wanted a leader who was of them. And it led to the excommunication, I think, of almost a third of the membership. And that has long resonance among the brethren, I think. And so I'm wondering if y'all could comment on the history, because this is not just an issue of today, but it's an issue that goes very far back and very deep into the church, and I think it leads to real ambivalence around leadership of people of color.
The Latino, the Mexicano in that case, is a large group. And I think there is that fear. Now, I heard, and Gina would know better, that there may have been a Maori kind of rebellion once. That's what I had heard. I don't know if it's true. I'm sorry? Oh, well, okay. But this was an organized, a very huge thing. What's so interesting, before I get to the photo, is that church leaders in Mexico, those who are Mexican, will say that so much of the good leadership that comes later of Mexico comes from those families from the Third Convention, which says something very interesting about them. And leadership is something fundamental about, do I get to lead my own? Do I get to speak for my own? Do my own know me when I speak? And I think among Latinos, of course, at that time, the Mexican Revolution was very nationalistic, very much about, throwing out the foreigner. So it was very nationalistic, and it impacted. And the interesting thing about the Third Convention, that part of it was that Margarita Bautista, who was a member of the Latino branch here and went back to Mexico, wrote a book which got him excommunicated. Now, there was other reasons why he got excommunicated, like polygamy. But he wrote a book where he said that, Mexico is really the right soil for the church to grow and expand. Okay? It was very nationalistic. But it was basically an anthropological historical work by an intellectual, not by a historian or an anthropologist. And that was, more than anything, a challenge to the whole notion of the promised land. That someone would imagine that in Mexico and the indigenous people were really the ones. And yet when you read the book, if you were a non-LDS and didn't know the politics, you'd say, interesting book, I may or may not agree, but it's not a it's not apostasy. It's not a theological challenge. It just, well, maybe it is a theological challenge, but you'd have to really know the nuts and bolts about Mormon theology. And yet, that challenge was seen as the fundamental. And the Mexican church has suffered since then. When, I think it was George Albert Smith who went to bring the saints back, or was it? Yeah. I think it was. When he brought them back, he made a promise to them. This was about the 30s. And he said, you will have your church leadership. That was enough. Yeah. Took to 1970 before they had their first Mexican stake president. We need to keep our promises. And if we promise, we need to be prophetic about it. And I think Latinos, like my ward, like every ward that you've gone to, they just don't trust that. They love the Lord. They trust in everything he says, except when he's making a choice. They don't know. That's an open case, whether it's going to be the right person or not. It's just, and most of us, now they surprise us, most of us can figure it out when it's going to be somebody else. Okay? You see the stake president spending, instead of 2 months, a year, like he did in our ward, interviewing and not interviewing a few people, but not the ones they should. And then they say, it took me a year to find out what God wanted. And what do you say to that? I mean, we're good, faithful members, and we believe, we do believe in the callings, right? But I think we ought to be intelligent enough to realize that that has to do more with the stewardship of a person. And so leadership has been a big issue and continues to be. And what has happened is there is that uncomfortableness, or no comfort with the idea of a leadership of color that is firm. And if you notice that, and in a very unfair way, most people of color aren't incredibly hot on their 70s because they're wonderful men but have no voice. No voice. They only speak in general conference with the theme of humility, humbleness, which is fantastic. But there's no leadership discussion. There's no theological discussion. There is no discussion about what this means to a church of color. And that's the reason why they're all foreign born, with the exception of one or two. They're all born outside, and they don't understand the issues, including, and it's a shame because the church places them in such difficult situations when they have to confront these things, and they themselves don't know how to deal with. And I guess we all know about what happened in the conference there at the Utah when they asked Elder Citati to say, and he repeated the old theology. And here's a wonderful man, an incredible man, who should be defending, not reaffirming, these old theological stories. And so, but that's what you do when you don't want people to grow and challenge. It may not be malicious, but it is systematic.
Looks like I get the last question. It seems to me that the big elephant standing in the kitchen with regard to equality and the Lamanite population in the church is, does God really express his pleasure by cursing people with different colors of skin? As near as I know, unless I've missed something, the official church position and the understanding of most Latter-day Saints is that, yes, Lamanites are dark-skinned because of the curse. Now, years ago, I talked with the late Eugene England, and he said, well, you know, maybe Nephi was upset and prejudiced, so when Laman and Lemuel left, they intermarried with the indigenous people and severed the Israelite covenant, and so Nephi interpreted their dark skin as a curse because they intermarried with the indigenous peoples. Well, I went home and had dinner and thought about that. Well, who did Nephi intermarry with to have enough descendants to fight the wars? So they would all have had that same color of skin. Recently, I read scholarly pieces by Mormons about nuancing the interpretation of this so-called curse. One author, forget his name, has written recently that the Lamanites actually adopted a physical skin, a clothing item that was dark of their own choice, and Nephi, that is what the darkness refers to. Other Mormon authors have tried to nuance the interpretation that it's a metaphorical darkness and so on. So my question is, does the church need to officially say skin color is a matter of evolution, adaptation, and natural selection, so that most of the members can get out from under this theological concept?
Yes. So I think we really need to look at the interconnectedness between the Mormon Church and American discourse and American history. And I think it will be helpful for the church to come out and talk about the science of, well, race, and I mean, it's a social category, but that has real world implications. But I think we have to also turn to having a bigger conversation about how that plays out, not only within Mormonism, but across the greater American landscape. And so, I mean, I hope one day that we can do that, but.
Real quickly, I think it's not the brethren who say, unless they're brethren of color. Because I think that when you see it, when you see that skin color doesn't mean anything, when our theology really says it doesn't mean anything, then it doesn't mean anything. I think we've had a few people that say it, but I think you need to see it. And that's why I harp back on this Latino Mormon nationalism, I guess some people would call it. But I think people of color need to say it. They need to be there, to be seen, to be said. I mean, there's 24 leaders in the church. We all love them, as I think I do. But they don't represent anything but whiteness. And that's a tragedy. And no matter what we say, if we say it tomorrow, everything was wrong, as we sort of say it, right, with the priesthood ban, it won't change anything, because it's what you see there that has the greater impact than what you say. Because tomorrow, whatever you said tomorrow, it'll still be the same picture, it'll still be the same people, and it'll still be the same issues and concerns that one group of people, legitimately wonderful, they are. But unfortunately, we rarely ever speak more than for ourselves and for those we know closely. And I think that will be seen, and it needs to be seen, not to be heard.
We actually have time for one brief question. Is there a microphone handy? Sorry, Boyd.
I will be brief, so don't keep anybody from their lunch. I work as a faculty at Brigham Young University, Idaho, and I've been there for like 3 years now. And I came from a reasonably kind of cosmopolitan experience in the UK. To a place which is blindingly white, and there are some black people. I've met both of them, but notwithstanding, as faculty in the communication department, I would really like to, and we do kind of talk about issues of multiculturalism and that kind of thing, but what would you, maybe very briefly, from a Latino, a historical, and a black perspective, what would you like to give the kids at BYU Idaho? What would you share with them by way of a multiculturalism primer? Just text, media, that kind of thing. I appreciate there's no such thing as a magic bullet. But what would you share with them just to get them on the path just to waft them towards kind of maybe changing some of the very fixed attitudes and ideas, which they've inherited, to be fair to them. They're good kids, they genuinely are, got lots of love and time for them. And so what would be your suggestions on that front?
And we do need to keep the answers brief.
So I would suggest James Baldwin, Bell Hooks, any of the essayists. I had mentioned Franz Fanon talks a lot about black subjectivity. And I think a lot of these essayists, you can apply what they've written into what we see within Mormonism and multiculturalism.
And I think helping them to understand Mormonism's own white, frat racial history so that they can see race in themselves and then start to act from a perspective of empathy towards other marginalized groups is really key in that process.
Read Octavio Romano, and then read about Eduardo Valderas and the documents, and read about the histories. I think you have to see the voices speaking to themselves. So, but we can sort of email.
Well, this has been a wonderful, thought-provoking session, as all the sessions have been in this conference. Unfortunately, as I said earlier, the damn clock rules. And if it's not the damn clock, it's our stomachs. So we're taking a break for lunch. We'll be back at 1 o'clock. As Brian said yesterday, there's a lovely place downstairs. It's fairly small, however. It's called the Rotisserie, a great Spanish chef, but not a lot of tables. If you want to eat elsewhere, there is a small sandwich deli in the library that has limited space. If you want to go further afield, there's a Taco Bell and a juice bar just through the liberal arts building towards the PE, right on the edge of the PE building. And then in the student center, there's a food court with all the fast food your demonic stomach could require. So please enjoy your lunch, and we'll be back here at 1 o'clock. Thank you, panelists.